And I'd like to welcome everybody here to Slocum Hall. I just want to give a very brief welcome and we'll go from there. The City Script Symposium series attempts to connect academic expertise, politicians, and local voices to understand how cities change and grow and how this can happen in inclusive ways. It's been a collaboration now for a couple of years between the Maxwell School and the School of Architecture here at Syracuse University. Today's topic, as many know, my research practice and teaching is really near and dear to my heart. It is based on an expansive idea of the city that contends that cities are based on the richness, density, and quality of their functional and social interactions. In our day and age, this means that a city is not merely a region's central core, but also includes the larger metropolitan terrain, a developed territory that can be well connected through its design in ways that are sustainable to the natural environment, society, and a diverse and healthy range of cultures. I'd like to thank the supporters of tonight's conversation on this essential matter: the School of Architecture, the Office of its Dean, the Maxwell School, the Campbell Institute, particularly Sunju Rebeck, who did a lot of logistics, and perhaps most importantly, the SU Cruise Grant Program. It's part of this recently launched Syracuse, or Invest Syracuse initiative. So thanks to all the participants as well as the audience here. And finally, I'd like to invite everyone afterwards to a reception in the atrium where you can meet the participants and keep the conversation going. Now I'd like to introduce my City Scripts colleague, Professor Carol Falkner, Associate Dean of the Maxwell School, who will introduce the event and topic in a bit more detail. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Carol Falkner.
So unlike Larry, I have to take my glasses off to read my introduction. So as Larry said, I'm Carol Falkner. I'm a professor of history as well as the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the Maxwell School. I'm one of the organizers of this event, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this discussion of Stretchy Cities. As Larry said, this is the latest in an ongoing collaboration between the School of Architecture and the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. The goal of City Scripts, which is the name of this collaboration, is to examine the intersection of policy and design in urban planning. We hope that this joint project will help ensure that policy and design are at the forefront when confronting the challenges facing cities in the United States and around the world. Our goal is to create sustained conversations between scholars and practitioners, architects and policymakers, journalists and planners, and politicians and citizens on the present and future of cities. We believe this series of events and the accompanying website are a unique partnership. The website is currently under construction, but you should be sure to visit it soon at www.cityscripts.syr.edu. So the website is going to extend the life of the symposia, creating a dynamic resource available to all. The website will feature panel transcripts and videos, as well as supplemental articles by leading critics and scholars. Today's panel, Stretchy Cities, contributes to the public deliberation on governance and planning in Syracuse, but also offers a reference point for other metropolitan areas as they engage in similar discussions on their future political and spatial composition. Indeed, each panel that we've organized takes on the challenge of a local problem that is also found in numerous urban environments throughout the US, Canada, and the world. Stretchy Cities focuses on the relationship between the classic city and a more stretched or regional urban environment. The future of I-81, the subject of our last panel, is part of this conversation as well. So my next task, which I am delighted to do, is to introduce Marianna Campo, who will moderate the panel and introduce the panelists. Marianna Campo is an urban designer and principal at Sasaki, Boston, with a portfolio that includes international and domestic, institutional, and urban projects. Marianne's research focuses on urban design and cultural identity, socio-ecological urban design approaches to urban resilience, and planning and design for higher education. Shifting across scales and contexts, Marianne's professional work includes a campus framework plan for Virginia Tech and an urban design vision for the Texas State Capitol District in Austin, Texas. You also may have seen her around campus because she's been very involved in the recent Syracuse University framework. I've also been spending a lot of time with her as well because she is doing a space study for Maxwell. Yay! In Kabul, Afghanistan, Marianne led an urban design team that studied informal settlement and the role of women in the city's development. And recent academic research includes collaboration with the World Bank on citywide approaches for communities vulnerable to flooding in Manila, Philippines, and urban design flooding infrastructure strategies for land reclamation in the Venice Lagoon and with the School of Architecture in Venice, Italy. Marianna Campo is a lecturer of urban design in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT and is an affiliated faculty member at MIT's Leventhal Center for Urbanism. With MIT-X, she co-created an online course, Site Planning Online, that focuses on sustainable urban design practices. She has held teaching appointments at Cornell, Wentworth Institute of Technology, and of course at the best place, Syracuse University. She holds a Master of Architecture in Urban Design from Harvard, a Master of Architecture from Cornell University, and a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Kentucky. Marianne's design work has been recognized with awards from the American Planning Association, the American Society of Landscape Architects, the Boston Society of Landscape Architecture, the Society of College and University Planning, and the Boston Society of Architecture. In 2016, the American Institute of Architects gave her its National Associates Awards. Please welcome Marianna Campo.
Great, thank you, Carol. It's wonderful to be back here at Syracuse, especially in the School of Architecture and working with the Maxwell School. Before we get started, I'd like to do a little poll in the audience to get a sense of who is actually attending this symposium. So for all of you who are students, can you raise your hand? Okay, great. Faculty and staff affiliated with the university? Great. And then all those who are residents who live within the community, not affiliated with the university. Okay, great. So you congregate together, right? Well, great. Thank you for being here. We are so excited to hear some different perspectives about Stretchy Cities tonight and how post-industrial metropolitan areas can be envisioned with our panelists of experts, local officials, and of course, you all. We want to welcome our guest presenters, David Owen and Roger Keel. David Owen is an author and a journalist with an impressive and wide variety of interests, among them golf, the theater, the debris of human consumption, and the reason we invited him here today, the world's natural resources and urbanization. To New Yorker readers, David Owen's work is probably familiar as he has been a staff writer there since 1991. Some of his books have taken root in articles first published in the magazine. Before his tenure at the New Yorker, David was a contributing editor at The Atlantic, Golf Digest, Popular Mechanics, and a senior writer at Harper's. New York satirist Andy Borowitz nominated David as one of the 50 funniest American writers. For those of you who are familiar with Borowitz's essays, high praise indeed. David's books include None of the Above, The Truth Behind the SATs, an expose of the testing industry now in the era of high-priced cheating scams more significant than ever. The Conundrum, How Scientific Innovation, Increased Efficiency, and Good Intentions Make Our Energy and Climate Problems Worse. Where the Water Goes, Life and Death Along the Colorado River. The Chosen One, Tiger Woods and the Dilemma of Greatness. And the soon-to-be-issued Volume Control, Hearing in a Deafening World. But it is in his book, Green Metropolis, that particularly resonates with the subject of today's discussion. In it, Owen argues for a green economy based off the ecological efficiency of dense cities, small dwellings, and the consequential reduced consumption of most urban dwellers. It is a fact-driven manifesto of sorts that challenges assumptions about the large waste and carbon footprint of human settlement. 10 years after its publication, it is still relevant and highly recommended. Next, we'll have Roger Keel. Roger Keel is York Research Chair in Global Suburban Studies and the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University in Toronto. He researches global suburbanization, urban political ecology, and regional governance. Professor Keel is the author of many books, including Massive Suburbanization, Rebuilding the Global Periphery, One Large-Scale Housing Project at a Time, Suburban Planet, Making the World Urban from the Outside In, Suburban World, Comparing the Governance of Globalizing Regions from the Outside In, Canadian Suburbia, From the Periphery of Empire to the Frontier of the Suburban Century. Professor Keel is the editor of Suburban Constellations, Global Suburbanisms book series, the co-editor of Suburban Governance, A Global View and Massive Suburbanization, and former co-editor of the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. In Suburban Planet, Professor Keel argues that growth of urban centers is not in their cores, but at their edges. The urbanization of the 20th and 21st centuries is a suburban phenomenon. In fact, he proposes that most of the Earth's soon-to-be 10 billion inhabitants will not live in conventional cities, but in suburban constellations, gated communities, squatter settlements, and many built forms in between. As co-founder of the International Network for Urban Research and Action, Keel was the inaugural director of the City Institute at York University. So please help me in welcoming David Owen and then Roger Keel.
Thank you. I just have to find myself here with help from someone. Thank you very much. You can just, this is just subliminal advertising. My wife and I got married 41 years ago. The summer we graduated from college, so any of you who are here are seniors need to get cracking. We accidentally spent our honeymoon in Toronto. But we were young and idealistic and naive, and we spent the first 7 years of our married life living in a utopian environmentalist community right here in New York State. We lived in a very small space, only about 750 square feet. We didn't have a car, we didn't have a washer or dryer. We walked to do our grocery shopping, places that we couldn't get to on foot. We took public transit. Because we lived in such a small space, we had very few energy-consuming appliances. Our electric bill worked out to about $1 a day. This is not where we lived, by the way. This is. Our apartment was on the east side of Manhattan at 69th and 2nd Avenue. And even though to most people, when they look at this picture, they see an environmental nightmare, in fact, this is the picture of sustainability. New York City has half of all the subway stops in the United States. It has really probably the only truly successful public transit system anywhere in the United States. It has, by at least an order of magnitude, the lowest car ownership of any place in the United States. Something like 71% of Manhattan households don't own even one car, and the ones that do don't use their car in the way that the rest of us do. The reason for these wonders is density, is the fact that when you pile people up on top of each other, when you shrink the distance between people and their destinations, inevitably their consumption shrinks. And as a consequence, New Yorkers have the smallest carbon footprints of just about anybody in the United States. New York City, in population, if it were made a state, it's larger in population than all but I think 11 states. And if New York City were made a state, it would rank last, number 51st in per capita energy consumption. The key is those cars that I mentioned and the fact that there are so few of them in New York, even though in this picture it looks like virtually every car in the world is there. In fact, because there's so many people, the car ownership is very low. Here's a very different kind of development. This is the familiar Apple flying saucer in Cupertino. It's a LEED platinum building and it's 100% energy self-sufficient and so on and so on. But actually, unlike New York, it's heavily car dependent. And which you can see if you don't look at the architect's rendering, but you actually look at Google Earth and see what it looks like. And you can see that everybody who works there basically arrives by freeway, and they park here in this parking garage. It has the Apple flying saucer actually has more space devoted to parking than it does to people. There's more square meters of parking spaces than there is of office space. You can also see that if you look at the view from outer space. They're way down here, and nobody lives in the flying saucer. You have to get there from someplace else. And in fact, this picture explains why so many people in Silicon Valley are working on autonomous vehicles, I'm pretty sure. I was staying in a hotel in downtown San Francisco and taking Uber to a 49ers game. And it took like days to get there, jammed in this very narrow neck of traffic. And it occurred to me that all these guys who work in Silicon Valley must have suddenly thought at the same time, if we didn't have to have our hands on the steering wheel, we would be able to be soliciting venture capitalists while we drive to and from work. And I would not be surprised if that's the case. Here's the counter case. This is New York City. The New Yorker used to be in this building. It's unlike the Apple flying saucer, this building, which is 1.6 million square feet of office space, has no parking lot. And the reason is that virtually everybody who works in it arrives either by public transit or on foot. New York City, Manhattan, is one of very few places in the United States where walking is a primary form of transportation. There really isn't any place else like it in the United States. But there's a difficulty in breaking our dependence on automobiles. And this I demonstrate with this. This is a slide that was created in the Tampa area in the late 1990s. The Tampa region was interested in creating a public transit system. And they made, this is a posed picture, but it's a scene that's familiar to anybody who has a car. It's a normal morning traffic jam. And what they did is they lined up all these people, and then they took all the people in the cars, and they sat them in the same road in chairs. And this is what they got. And even though I've seen this slide many times, it still surprises me. And I showed it. I have an environmentalist friend who I showed him this pair of slides, and he says, you know, you shouldn't use a fake image in a talk like this. And I blew it up for him and showed him, no, that's every single person who was in those cars is sitting in those chairs. You could fit them all in a single bus. The challenge, though, is that if you're one of these people sitting in this car and you look at this, you think, nirvana, my driving problem is solved. Now there's room for me to drive to work because all those other people are off the road. And so while it's to the extent that it's easy, it's much easier to get a municipality to decide that public transit is a good idea. It's much harder for them to create the conditions under which public transit actually works, which is you have to be like New York in that driving has to be the least palatable option. New York City, anybody who's visited New York City has had the experience of sitting in a taxi cab stuck on Fifth Avenue while a little old lady on the sidewalk overtakes him and disappears over the horizon. You have to make driving too expensive and too unpleasant to actually do it, because if it's not, people tend to do it. This points up a challenge with cars. This is another picture of New York City. This is, I'm one of the few people who will argue that traffic congestion actually has environmental value for that very reason. Traffic congestion makes people hate their cars and makes them seek alternatives. Traffic congestion is usually presented as an environmental problem. It's not an environmental problem, it's a driving problem. Driving is the environmental problem. if we address the congestion problem, the driving problem, without addressing the environmental problem, we don't make things better. In fact, we make them worse. It's an example of what I'll call Owen's law, which is that all consequences are unintended consequences. Here's another example of Owen's law. This is Boulder, Colorado. Boulder, Colorado is one of the, the green signal cities that were certainly in the view of the people who live in Boulder, it's the greenest place in the United States. But there's lots of environmentalists, lots of people who care very deeply about the environment, about climate change. And one feature of Boulder that people who live there will talk to you about is the way that the city has arrested its sprawl across the lane in front of the Front Range. There's a kind of a green border, a green margin that goes around it. The city began acquiring farmland outside its city limits in the 1970s. It partly to contain the spread of the city itself, and partly to provide a source of water in the future. But what has happened with Boulder and with other cities that have attempted to create an urban boundary, like Portland, Oregon is another example, is that instead of halting sprawl, you just leapfrog it, and in fact often make it worse. And Boulder's up here, and this is a corner of the barrier that surrounds much of Boulder. The city itself is up here, and this is the sprawl that has spread beyond it. By halting growth inside the city is incredibly desirable. It was halted at sort of 1970s level automobile-dependent density. There's not enough room for all the people it needs to support itself, so people who work in Boulder, who can't afford to live there, who can't find a place to live, often have to come from far away, commuting from farther away than they would. It's ironically what was intended initially as a way to halt sprawl, to contain sprawl, became an accelerator of sprawl, an amplifier of sprawl, and it metastasized beyond it, and in many ways became more harmful than what would have been otherwise. I've been a big advocate for the value of urban density, whereas the reason that I began to think about this issue was that 35 years ago, my wife and I moved into a small town that is the opposite of New York. And when we moved, it's a town of about 4,000 people. There are places in town where you can go, you can't see another habitation. You look out, we live on a dirt road. There's a nature preserve across the road. My wife just saw a mother bear and 3 cubs walking across the road. When we moved there, it felt like that we'd stepped into Arcadia. In fact, it was an environmental disaster. We went from having no car to having 1 car, then realized that when we had 1 car, if you have 1 car, you can't go pick it up at the mechanic if you don't have another car to go get it. So we got a 2nd car. And then as a result of a mild midlife crisis, we ended up with a 3rd car, which then, when our kids got old enough to drive, became a necessity. We live in a recycled house. It was built in the 1790s, which means that we might as well put the furnace in the yard and just let it burn up in the sky, because it has basically nothing in the way of insulation. It's the town on the right. It was actually the model for the town in Gilmore Girls, Stars Hollow, and it's so it's an incredibly nice place to live, as places outside of cities are. You can see why people don't do it. It was incredibly appealing to the producers of Gilmore Girls, and we've stayed there. We've been in the same house since 1985. I've also been an elected official in our town. I was on the zoning commission for 20 years. I was the chairman for 6 years, and in that capacity, I experienced at firsthand a number of the issues that we're talking about here, and some of the difficulties that people face when they try to address issues of urban planning at any scale, in cities and suburbs. This is a 19th century picture of our village green. This is a an 18th century house that was remodeled in the 1800s to turn it into a 19th century house. But these, everything, this is the Congregational Church, this building over here, this house here, they're all still here. And the interesting thing about them, this is part of what people love about my town. And this is the other side of that green. These houses were all built in the 1700s. The interesting thing about my town is that while people love these, our zoning ordinance would make it impossible to build any of them today. So it's what people think of as the soul of our town, but they're all completely unbuildable because they don't meet lot coverage requirements. They cover too much of their lots. They don't meet any setback requirements. These houses are on the green. The front lot line actually runs about there. They're much too close together. They cover too much of the lot. So even when you talk to people in town about what they love about the town, they will, on the one hand, be able to identify what they love about the town, but at the same time hate any suggestion that zoning regulations should be modified to make possible the thing that they love. And I think it's not the only urban place where this happens. There was a project, a proposed building project in Seattle. Some developer wanted to build a pedestrian-friendly apartment building in downtown Seattle, and in order to do it, they wanted to put it right in the middle of the dense part of the city, where people could live without cars. And in order to do this, they wanted permission from the land use commissions to provide fewer parking spaces than they were required to by the Seattle ordinance. And the people who argued the most strongly against it were very environmentalist, people who you would have thought might be in favor of it, but they were worried that all these people were going to park on the streets and clog up the streets. So the opponents are not always who you think they're going to be. The thing that we found in our town is that people tend to think that if they worry about the preservation of a place, they tend to think of a rule that is restrictive, no matter what it restricts, as beneficial. That saying no preserves what they like, even if it's preserving things that they don't like. We had a great deal of trouble trying to switch our parking rules from requiring minimum numbers of parking spaces to requiring maximum number of parking spaces. You wouldn't think that would be hard, but it was incredibly difficult. One other example of Owen's law about all consequences being unintended consequences. This is I'm sure, on your freshman architecture exam, you have to, this is the Seagram building in New York City, one of the most famous skyscrapers in the world. And when it was built, it was revolutionary not only because it was made of steel and glass, but because it had this open plaza around it. Unlike, it wasn't part of the wall of buildings in Manhattan. And it was such a breakthrough, in fact, that New York changed its zoning ordinance to reward builders for creating plazas around buildings. But the unintended consequences is visible in this photograph, which is there's nobody on this plaza. This is a good example of what Jane Jacobs called a border vacuum. It's a space, an open space that repels human occupancy. The best thing that ever happened to it was rules about not smoking inside buildings, because really smokers are the only people who use it. And this is not a posed photograph. You can see from this photograph too that it's somehow it's unattractive to people who are on foot. And in fact, another border vacuum, and one that Jacobs herself talked about, is Park Avenue, which is right there. It's too wide. It separates too much. The buildings along it are apartment buildings and office buildings, and there's nothing at the street level that anybody wants to do. So it's also an example of what I think is sometimes true, which is that the very worst examples of urban planning throughout the world are things that we did on purpose, things that people did on purpose. And some of the very best examples are things that nobody planned, nobody designed. This is Greenwich Village in New York. You can see it's full of people, unlike the plaza in front of the Seagram building. It's uses that are mixed in a way that zoning ordinances, even in New York City, don't permit now. The street's too small, there's not enough places to park, there are too many uses mixed together, and it happened entirely by accident. So that's the thought that I'll leave you on, and thank you.
Thank you. Just clip it on. Good evening. Thanks for the invitation. I gladly came from the other side of the lake and drove. It was a little later than I thought I would come in. That's part of the fact that one drives through a stretchy city all the way from Toronto to Syracuse. And thanks for the kind introduction. You will see a few points of dialogue now, but it's on. I have chosen to a different starting image, even though that's the country commune is exactly, because I live in the country right now also. I live in our cottage north of Toronto because I'm on sabbatical. So I can relate to that, and that garden looks very much like the garden, mostly my wife. So, okay, which one, this one? Yeah. So I in a School of Architecture, so I want to start with this, falling water. It's a good place to start to talk about the Stretchy City, in my view. This is a magnificent building, and it is one of the most beautiful things I've seen in my life. And it's important to keep in mind that it's so beautiful because it's so unique. Because just outside of it, this is what's happening, which looks more like, it's not as classy as the town in which you live, but it's sort of the more, everyday version of what came of the single-family home of the 20th century. It's also important to understand that falling water is all by itself, but single-family homes mostly, even my cottage, come in shocks or in groups, and so we need to always see what came of falling water in the environment where it now lives. And this is, unfortunately, for most of those single-family homes, none of those are anywhere in the same class as falling water, but the idea of having everything inside one home, all the gadgets, everything that connects to the outside world, everything that combines and defines the family, you will find in each one of those. And that's Mississauga outside of Toronto. It's a suburb, which is now 800,000 people, soon 1 million. For those of you who've flown into Toronto, you would have seen this because it is right by the airport. So that's the banal version of this. That's where we have come in the 20th century. But since it's 2019, it's the 100th anniversary of the Bauhaus, I figured I'd put that in too, because while falling water is one form in which the 20th century, operated, that was another form, and that led to this sort of thing, which happened in the 1920s in my hometown. I was born and grew up in Frankfurt in Germany. This was built in the 1920s, 1929, so it's 90 years old. That was working class housing outside of the city. So in Europe, this is more valid for Canada and Europe. You have fewer such examples in the United States. But this is what the banlieue in Paris is built on. This is so the archetype of the periphery in much of Europe and much of Toronto. 50% of the population of Toronto live in towers. I put that in because this looks a bit stark. There are no trees yet. It's just been built. Today, this is actually very nice. It's a very favored living environment. People love to live there, and those people who live in there, they treat this like in Toronto, people treat Maple Leafs tickets. Don't give them up. But of course, we now know that the Germans and the French and so on were not the only ones. All of Eastern Europe built places like that. But now this is a particular global urban or peripheral form. So when we talk about the stretchy city in China, this is what you will see. This is outside of Shanghai, at Newtown. One thing I didn't want to stress too much today is that there's a third form which the Bauhaus to some degree wanted to get rid of, which is informal settlements, which of course now Mike Davis would argue most of the people will live in some way of slum, some form of slum. It's a controversial debate, but this is a Gecekondo in Istanbul, and that informal housing is of course the form of housing in which a lot of people live. I've just spent 2 weeks in West Africa earlier in the summer, and just last week came back from India, and that sort of form of housing is everywhere. But I don't want to stress it too much here tonight because Syracuse doesn't have that kind of housing, at least I wouldn't think so. The interesting thing, of course, is that in a period where housing is financialized and is treated mostly as a commodity, now the Turkish state has mostly destroyed the Gecekondos and has built this kind of housing on the ruins of the Gecekondo. So this is the same kind of process you see like in Shanghai or in Hanoi and any other Asian metropolis, but Istanbul is a particularly interesting example for this kind of massive suburbanization. Look at this is Kayashir on the European side of Istanbul. These are massive settlements that you will see all over the Asian continent. Now, these are now those two forms that I've suggested to turn into the 20th century. The broadacre city, Frank Lloyd Wright's idea, and Le Corbusier's model on the right side here. So this is the archetype of the city as it expanded throughout the 20th century and still does. You can make fun of it, as The Guardian did on April Fool's Day, to say this is broadacre city of today. You know, it's like when I first saw it, I thought it was real, and then I noticed it was April 1st, and it's kind of funny. But you know, this is when I drove from my cottage yesterday into Toronto. This is in the same farmers' fields as this in the northern border of Toronto. Now, this is the end of the subway line in Vaughan, so you see this kind of development happening there. So you have, in a classical suburban environment, a very undense environment, you have now these kinds of hubs being built. This is, as I said, I was in India last week. This is a typical extension of a city in one of the corridors that the Indian state is favoring. It looks like a ghost city. It's in Gurgaon on a Chinese-built private mode of transportation. But that is not just in India. I can show you pictures like that from Brazil, and the reason is I don't travel all the time, but I was the principal investigator of a big research project with 50 people. So we did a lot of work around the globe and had workshops with communities around the globe. And this is some of the output that we've had from this, and I'm happy with this. I wanted to show you that subtle advertisement, but also I wanted to show you that to say that this is my background. I'm not an architect, but we did this research project on suburbanization, and that's very important for the kind of things that I will say in what I have left. So what is important when we think about how to govern the stretchy city, it is important, as we take from these two Eastern European colleagues who thought about this after the fall of the wall and how to think about an environment. They had 170 million units of prefabricated high-rise housing in Eastern Europe, plus this kind of self-built housing, which is in former Yugoslavia. Tito looked the other way when the construction workers came back from Switzerland and Germany and came with their cars full of construction material, and they built their own houses. It's like talking about unzoned. This is unzoned. But this is now the reality of much of Europe, this mix of very planned types of peripheries and cities, and this sort of mix of self-built, informal type of housing. And so what's important is that we need to confront this idea of suburbanization because it is giving us a mirror of the society in which we live. So suburbanization is a magnifying glass, this process of suburbanization. So I give you an example closer to your home. I mean, I'm not saying Syracuse is like Cleveland, it's another lake, another city, but this is a typical American city. This is an American city. I like to show this to my students who in Toronto have mostly grown up in that kind of stretched city. Now, in 1948, in 2002, the same number of people use vastly different built environments. But this is completely meaningless if I just show you this. It doesn't mean anything. So we can have a debate about density. It doesn't mean anything until I show you this picture, which is you, more than Canadians, Americans understand this picture right away. It's a map of segregation, right? Because density doesn't mean anything if you don't know who lives in it and who lives in what part of town. And this is race. It could also be class. Could be gender. It could be all manner of divisions that we have in society. It's those divisions that we also need to understand, not just the built form, the densities, those kinds of things. That's what those Eastern European colleagues mean by holding up a mirror. We understand our society when we look at that. So, having talked about Cleveland, let's look north of the lake here to Toronto, and here you can see, and this is, it's not better or worse, it's just different. In Toronto, we now have the situation that the majority of non-white people don't live in the inner city, as in many American cities, but the majority of non-white people live in the periphery. So the purpler it is, the less white it is. And this also happens to be an image of immigration. So most of the new immigrants who come from non-European countries, from South Asia and from East Asia in particular, live in the burgeoning, emerging suburbs of Toronto, right? So if I just talk about density and city and suburb, I don't understand anything because I don't know who lives there. I don't know how long these people have been there. What is the income of those people? What are their aspirations? Right? What do they want? So this is important. So here is a typical mini mall, way out past the airport. So you can see what kind of stuff you're being offered here. This is not your quote-unquote white bread old Anglo suburb, right? That's not what that is. So this is a completely different suburban society. What am I doing? This one? No. Oh, God. Too many choices. So that is the typical Canadian suburban form, the tower and the copy of Falling Water. But we also have grand, I must say, don't use that word often, grand civic architecture in the suburbs. So the suburbs are not just boring, masses of Lego houses. They're also, of course, now trying to make a statement. We also have land use planning that contains that, and none of that is sprawl. My students will fail the test if they use the adjective unplanned with the word sprawl. Toronto has some of the best planned sprawl in the world. And it is because we have very strong land use regulations. And here is the gray built-up area of Toronto. Then we have the green belt. And those areas are very tightly regulated. The green belt cannot be built in. The only thing you can build in it is roads and modes of transportation, because now we have, exactly as David said, leapfrogging to the other side of the green belt, right? So that's a problem. I don't have time to talk about this, but it's a huge problem we need to take into account. Now, the other thing about Toronto, as it is in many American cities, is that talking about density. The city, people live in the city. I live in the city. I live actually right here on the beach. Right here, in one of the most super gentrified areas, where today, I've lived there for 28 years. Today, an academic like me couldn't buy a house there. Right? I have only bankers and lawyers next to me. But I live there now. And, well, right now I live in the cottage, but rented out the house, which is, you know, it's possible. But you can see everything that's yellow on this. This is the city of Toronto, 3 million people. Everything that is yellow on this is single-family zoning, right? So who are these people in the city that talk about the suburbs as non-dense? This is the city of Jane Jacobs. We just heard about Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs lived longer in Toronto than in New York, right? So she would praise that kind of city, but when you come like me from Europe, you think this is a very undense city, right? So we need to think about the categories that we use to talk about this. It's also important that in the suburbs, you have these mega zones and knowledge-intensive districts. By the airport, by York University, where I work, which is right up here. So you have, this is where the high-tech industry is. That's where a lot of creativity is. It's not just downtown. Right? It's also downtown. You see that the biggest, reddest blob is downtown. I'm not saying it's not there. Right? It's also important to look at the suburbs not just as residential places, but also as places of production, globally linked production. This is BMWs outside of the city of Leipzig in East Germany that are going from a Zaha Hadid-built automobile plant to an airport where they're being shipped, or to a train station out in the periphery. And this is in South Africa. No, it's not. That's actually, I've changed the image. There's snow on the ground. This is outside of Toronto too. I just changed that image, sorry. But it's the idea that there's also a commercial role being played in the suburbs. Yeah, no snow in there is snow. I've seen snow in South Africa, but not like that. So the other thing that's important about those kinds of landscapes is the perspective and the scale at which we look at it. So on the left side, this is me flying into LA, where I used to live for many years. You fly into LA and you see this archetypical landscape of single-family homes. As I said before, everything is supposed to happen in the house. You have to have everything in the house. But you can only have everything in the house because you have a landscape at just 3 or 4 kilometers, 2 or 3 miles away. It looks like that on the same flight. Took the same out. This is the picture I took a minute later. This is the industrial commercial landscape, the warehouses, also in LA, flying into LAX, right? So you cannot have this without that, and it's very important. These are not different worlds. They're very close together, and they inform each other, right? All right. I also want to make absolutely clear, coming back to Manhattan, when I'm talking about global suburbanization, but I'm not saying it's all happening in the suburbs. We also have frantic reurbanization. So none of these buildings were in existence 28 years ago when I moved to Toronto. Not a single one of the buildings that you see here. Now they're all there, right? This is in my lifetime. An entire city was built inside Toronto on railway lands, right? So this is also happening. So suburbanization, I spare you the definitions, but I wanted to show you that I have a definition. It's important that the suburbanization is seen as a process. We're not talking about the suburb as a thing. It's really important because only if we talk about suburbanization as a process do we understand what it does. But I want to move on, and as I sort of move towards the end of this, I want to move on that it's not suburbanization, but it's now post-suburbanization that we need to look at when we talk about stretchy cities. So this is building and rebuilding. It's de-densification, but it's also densification. It's complexification, diversification at the same time. This is not bland, rolled out subdivisions anymore. We have a very complex landscape in post-suburbia. And this is perhaps, that's one of the most influential people for me, a German planner by the name of Tom Sieverts, created this idea of in-between city, Zwischenstadt. Well, this is my hometown, Frankfurt again. It shows you the nature of that stretchy metropolis. This is a very good image in my view of demonstrating that everything sort of hangs together in a spatial but also in a functional sense. One such place is the city of Brampton. just northwest of Toronto, 700,000 people now. It's right here, that red thing, north of the airport. Again, city of Toronto. Those high-rise buildings earlier that I showed you, they were right here in York region. So Brampton is interesting because it grew from basically nothing, 40,000 people in 1971 to I have to amend that slide, in 2011, 523. Now, with the last census in 2016, it was almost 700,000. It will have 800,000, maybe a million. And it's important that that city of Brampton has now hired Larry Beasley, who is the guy who invented the term Vancouverism. He was the city chief planner of Vancouver. And has anybody been to Vancouver? It's all those tall buildings, and that he invented that mode of city building. And he was now hired by that city, by the suburban city of Brampton, to create a plan, but I get to this in a moment. The city of Brampton is a hyper-diverse city. So my colleague Jay Pitter calls this hyper-diversity. It's an intersectionality that requires us to acknowledge that our cities contain diversities within diversities within diversity. So it's not only black and white, it's not only male and female, it's not only this and that. It is a hyper-diverse environment. So Brampton, mostly South Asian, but also has everybody. Everybody's in Brampton. And now that city needs to think about what its people is, who they are, to understand where they go, how they go forward. So out of that Larry Beasley planning comes this vision statement. Their city be arranged, governed, seen, and celebrated as a mosaic of people, places, and endeavors of all kinds. That's not your common suburb talk, right? That's a completely different discourse. And that is important to understand. Now, another big influence in my thinking, I'm sure that some of you are familiar with his name, Lars Lerup, an architect, who has written this really fabulous book about the continuous city. And I'm using this metaphor of the continuous city the way Larry, I guess, uses the word stretchy city. I think it's another term that gets to that. And I think Lerup is very good at nailing this because he's both looking at it spatially and architecturally, but he also has a keen interest in the social. So he says that is why the artificial separation of city and suburb has been catastrophic. He calls it catastrophic. He doesn't call the suburb catastrophic. He calls the separation of the two catastrophic. This binary of thinking squandered the potential to see the urban materially. Materially because everything hangs together. Another influence on my thinking here is Henri Lefebvre, the French philosopher. I'll spare you that, but it is really about a global urban society in which we live. Right? And that we have a right to that society. That all our rights talk now, the right to the city, but also has to be the right to the suburb, is coming out of that idea that we live in a completely urbanized society. Now, I could have bored you, and maybe I bore you anyway, but I could have bored you with talking like a political scientist, which I am. And to show you my pedigree, I've written all these papers about regional governance, and I'd be happy to talk about that. But I didn't want to do that, right? We have done years of study. Toronto is the most studied city when it comes to regional governance. And I've been doing this now for 25 years. And there's a lot to be said about a formal institutional analysis of what holds a region together or what blows it apart. But I wanted to sort of tailor it more to the questions that I think would be important in the context here. So what are the tasks that need to be solving in a stretchy region? Most issues deal with service delivery in a rapidly changing. That's still, for most politicians, most policymakers, the most difficult to solve issue. And who pays for it, of course. Right? And then the changing economics, demographics, and geographies that I told you about in Brampton or in Gurgaon and any of those places, they are a real challenge because we still live with our minds in the 20th century. Haven't arrived yet really in the 21st century. What's important to understand is the center now becomes an island, just one island, floating in a sea of urbanizing countryside, right? So it's not like the center anchors everything the way it used to, but it's just one island. It has to be connected to the other islands in the urban region. So one of the ways in which we did this in our project when we had this research project, we also had a policy angle to that project. So we connected a whole lot of partners, architects, cities, municipalities, academics, and we brought them together once a month and put them in a room. Every one of these partners hosted one of these events, and we talked about our joint issues. The reason why this was successful, we called it the Greater Toronto Suburban Working Group, which is a cumbersome title. But the reason why this was successful is because none of these people actually had to make any decisions. Right? So they could leave the meeting without having given anything away. But they spoke their mind. And we wrote this manifesto type thing. And we developed the methodology. Me is my, us is my colleague, Sean Hurdle, and who is a planner and consultant in Toronto, and myself. And we developed this model of a round table to have people speak to one another across the binary and the divides. Right? These are all from different sectors, these partners. They were from the social welfare sector, from the economic sector, the transportation sector. So we actually used this to do a study for the Metrolinx, the transportation agency in Toronto, which was about transportation racism and racist justice issues in the transportation system in Toronto. The poorer and the less white you are, the worse you're off in Toronto's transportation system, like in many transportation systems. So we got all these people together in the city and we started talking about what, instead of pointing fingers, you drive, you need parking, or pointing fingers and saying we are in a total mess when it comes to transportation, we actually brought people together and had people talk about how we perhaps can solve some of those issues. I'm coming to the end now. So one of the things I find important is now a lot of people are beginning to think the city from the outside in. And one country where this is particularly happening is Australia, which is the most suburban nation in the world. And there are some colleagues here in Australia who talk about degrowth in the suburbs, a radical urban imaginary. So they think about the climate emergency, not from David's slide as New York as the good example, but to look at the suburbs as the place from where we need to start thinking about this. So what can we do in this suburban environment? So here we have a completely different understanding than the city people telling the suburbanites, you need to drive less. You need to do this, live in smaller houses. Do something about your front yards. That gesture of the inner city telling the rest of the region what to do, that has to be given up. So we need to need to be at eye level. We need to talk to one another. And I'm not apologizing for the suburbs here. There are terrible things happening that we heard in David's talk. These are not good things that are happening in the suburb when it comes to climate and all those kinds of, and sustainability. But we cannot blame people for having to drive. They're never going to come around to actually talking to us about this. We also need to give up this idea that everything is new, which is the idea that the suburbs were built on. The suburbs live off their newness, and they were never meant to grow old. But now we need to think about how we repair them, how a suburb can be a place of experiment. We need to understand the suburb again in a civic manner as a place of democratic practices. But we also need to challenge ourselves more. I talked earlier about financialization. I talked a lot about property implicitly. The suburbs are not just a place which are houses that are not sustainable. The suburbs are also a place of wealth accumulation for privileged people. Right? When you're an immigrant from Europe or from South Asia, you tend to own a house in Toronto. When you're a black Torontonian, it's not that easy because you're excluded from certain housing markets. So the question of justice is also in the middle of that kind of rethinking. So I call this here abolition. We can talk about this in other terms also, reparations. Right? The land question is at the core of that rethinking. We cannot talk about democracy as a formal process in keeping the wealth so unevenly distributed in our societies, right? So we need to challenge ourselves in the stretchy city, right? So the radical suburban imaginary, going back to our Australian colleagues, we need to defy the hypertrophic urbanism, that non-sustainable urbanism. We need to resettle the suburbs. We need to provide self-governance for the suburbs. That means something different in Australia than it does that home rule means in the United States. But we mostly need to understand our society in motion. We need to understand our societies as social movements that are striving towards something that is better. And this may all sound a bit off the wall, but there are people who now are trying to retrieve different kinds of histories of suburbia, and one of them is Amanda Colson-Hurley, who has written this fantastic book about radical roots of suburbia in the United States. This is just the eastern United States. This is around here. So we don't need to look far. We don't need to go to Eastern Europe or to Frankfurt to look for those kinds of experience. We can go back to the roots of the United States or Canada itself to think differently about the role of the suburb in the stretchy city. So where does this leave us? What are the new diverse patterns? These are some questions. Is the suburban planet the extended city? How to govern and design this common, more dispersed urban pattern? And we, of course, ask ourselves, where is politics in the urban region, not just policy? So, is stretchiness a limitation or an opportunity? So the stretchiness of today's urban agglomerations and rural constellations alike are experienced by most inhabitants as problematic, not as fonts of possibility. You've heard of the Yellow Vest protest in France. They are from the stretchy city. Right? A lot of them are happening in places that you don't go to when you go on vacation. But that's where French people live, and they need to get to work too. So they also need 2 or 3 cars, right? Despite Paris being the ultimate model of sustainability, most French people live in places like the stretchy city. It would have to be in order to mobilize. It would have to be, though, in order to mobilize the condition, the concept as a progressive site for action, the stretchy city, on the important topics of urban life today, in particular social justice and climate change. We cannot overlook those. We have to look at social justice and climate change as motivators for the politics. And then it's just because that was the task I was given to think about design. I wanted to just. I'm not a designer, as I said, I'm a political scientist. But is the design environment just the built environment? Or what other things do we design? Automated cars, vehicles is also a design, but it's not a building. But it is a design in people's mind, as David told us. Landscape of dispersed metropolis comes with a twofold myth and a promise. The myth is twofold in the sense that the dispersion itself will solve the problem. People have always moved away from the city, even before white flight became a moniker in this country. People have always moved away from the city to solve problems. Right? But that's a myth. You cannot solve the city's problems by moving away from it. And the other thing is that what I already said about newness is the other myth. Secondly, the promise of that out there consists of the idea ingrained in the suburbanism since its beginning, the extended city will never appear old. It's always re-emerging and being redefined. This is Brampton again. I want to leave you with that image. Thank you very much.
Great. So now that we've had presentations by David Owen and Roger Kill, it'd be great to talk about stretchy cities conceptually. There's a lot of themes that we're hearing in tonight's discussion, from even the language that we use in how we describe our built environments to the way that we're starting to understand other components that include policy, mobility, transportation, and ways that we're thinking about density. All those are framing ways that we're understanding the built environment, but the decision-making process, and of course the people who live there. But before we get started, I'd just like to introduce two respondents. We have two local officials joining us tonight who can really speak to some, I think opportunities and challenges that we're seeing within our area of Syracuse. The first is Ed Michaelenko. Ed is the supervisor for the town of DeWitt. Before serving in that capacity for 11 years, he has been a DeWitt town councilor and a strong advocate of budget constraint, open government, neighborhood improvements, and the environment. President of the Onondaga Environmental Institute, he's co-authored 5 books and many technical publications on environmental fate and the effects of chemicals for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, National Library of Medicine, and the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry. OEI is dedicated to environmental education, research, planning, and restoration in Central New York. It is the corporate sponsor for the Partnership of Onondaga Creek and the Onondaga Earth Corporation. Supervisor Michaelenko's official bio lists an impressive number of state grants and federal grants that he's currently administering, all of them addressing environmental and monitoring, remediation, and education. Supervisor Michaelenko holds a PhD from the College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse. His research focuses on the effects of chemicals in the environment. He has conducted the first base-wide ecological risk assessment of a military installation at Cape Canaveral Air Station in Florida. Supervisor Michaelenko is twice the recipient of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Environmental Quality Award. He has taught high school biology, chemistry, held adjunct faculty positions at ESF and Syracuse University, where he has taught courses in ecology, the American environmental movement, environmental science, and environmental education for teachers. Thanks for joining us tonight. And then our last respondent is Khalid Bey, who has been holding a seat on the Syracuse Common Council for 7 years. Since 2017 as Common Councilor at Large and President pro tempore for the city of Syracuse. He serves as chair of the Economic Development Downtown and Metropolitan Planning Committee, is co-chair of the Homeless and Housing Vulnerable Committee, Neighborhood Preservation, the Intergovernmental Service Consolidation, and the Charter, Rules, Procedure, and RFP committees. Councilor Bey has pushed for government transparency, and for 15 years has been an advocate for underserved communities within our area throughout the city. His interest in the support of grassroots economic development and sustaining employment is supported by his commitment to the Atlantean Group, a community development entity that assists in the economic enfranchisement of low-income individuals and communities in Syracuse. Councilor Bey is the author, and he's the co-author of many books, including The African American Dilemma, an examination of the psychological effect that slavery has had on people of African descent, Necessary Adjustments, My Opinion on Government, and From My Eyes, Community Memoirs, a collection of opinion articles on issues that affect the African American community in Syracuse. He's a board member at Home Headquarters and at the Faith and Hope Community Center. Councilor Bey has lectured at colleges and universities, speaking about personal identity, human behavior, and human relationships. So thank you all for being here tonight. So for the first 10 minutes or so, we want to spend some time with Ed and then Khalid responding to some of the presentation material that we've just seen. We'll start with Ed, I think, tonight.
Thank you. I just want to say I'm honored to be here tonight. I love these kinds of conversations. As you heard from my bio, I have taught in the past, and I always loved the classroom and these types of conversations. And I got politics in the way. And so it keeps me from having the time to do that. But I got involved in politics for environmental reasons, and the conversations here just exposed a number of conversations that have been ongoing since Paul Ehrlich's population bomb and Garrett Hardin's lifeboat ethics through the 80s and 90s. And I'll just say from the Institute side of things, I've worked for a number of years in some environmental justice grants. We work with trying to put together green job training programs. Healthy homes is an area that we've been involved in for years. As the sponsor for the partnership for Onondaga Creek, there's a number of things we've working on and we're still working on. We've been promoting flood control strategies for Onondaga Creek, but right now there's 850 properties inside the city of Syracuse along the creek that are required to put out flood insurance. Collectively, those 850 property owners pay over $2.5 million a year. That $2.5 million a year in flood insurance could be better be directed to social improvements and other conditions inside the watershed. Most of those individual property owners really can't afford that insurance. So without getting off on too much of a tangent, Onondaga Creek was designed to move sewage out of the city streets and into the lake. So in the early 1900s, the Sewer Intercepting Board for the city of Syracuse, will think about it, the sewage that came off the streets would lie in the creek, and the stench was unbearable in the warm summer months, and so the creek was lined for the purpose of getting that sewage out to the lake and out of the city. Over time, it wasn't 100 years later that sewage treatment came into play. So I've been involved in the infrastructure issues associated with these areas, and then there's a number of projects that we're working in the upper Onondaga Creek area as well with the Onondaga Nation, and one of the cultural heritages of theirs is subsistence fishing, and so we're in projects where we're trying to promote brook trout restoration throughout the watershed. The DeWitt side of things, you know, there's a number of issues as well. DeWitt is a very diverse suburb. We do have those traditional neighborhoods where very wealthy individuals have coalesced, and it's predominantly residential in character. But on the other side of it, DeWitt has 45% of the industrial lands in Onondaga County. And I always attribute my becoming an environmentalist because I grew up in an era when those industries were all in full swing. And I could tell you the company's sound of their furnace while I laid in my bed at night. So the bad news is all those industries have moved away, and those high-paying blue-collar jobs are gone. The good news is the water's clean, because we monitor Lake Creek and the areas throughout the watershed. And so there's many things that we've done in DeWitt to try to transition from that blue-collar industrial economy of 50 years ago to an economy for the future. And so the first thing is, I tell everyone all the time, zoning is the key to what you want your community to look like 50 years from now. A number of the speakers have pointed to that. And so we performed the first comprehensive plan and update of our code and ordinances for 50 years. The last time that code in the town of DeWitt was touched was in 1960. We have placed an emphasis on mixed-use development and density. And we've tried to restructure our thoroughfares and our main secondary streets to accommodate that higher density as we go forward. We have a district in the north that is largely brownfields and former industries, but there's 30 hotels that sit along that. And so we have a major project that pushes recreation, but we'd love to see recreational tourism take off at exit 35 along the thruway. So we have a project called Carrier Park. And so again, the other thing I can say is in climate change, we've done a number of green initiatives. As I speak, the two major ones are we're constructing a 2.6 megawatt solar farm on the landfill at the Cedar Bay Park along the Erie Canal Trail, and we are converting all our streetlights to LED. But we'll be the first municipality that we know of that is totally free of fossil fuels for electricity by the end of this year, and we've made a commitment to totally free ourselves from all fossil fuels and remove our carbon footprint by 2035.
Good evening. First, I'm going to apologize ahead of time. I am battling probably one of the most irritating colds or coughs. So if you see me pause a few times, that's what's happening up here. I thought Mr. Owen had some interesting points. I read up on them a little bit before the symposium today. I think it's a pretty practical argument to say that New York City could be considered more green than, say, Portland and a few others. Clearly, because of its walkability, the city of Syracuse has made quite the effort over the years since I've been in office, excuse me, to move our city in that direction. It's been a part of our philosophy that increased walkability not only improves social interactions, but also local spending. And so there's a lot of benefit, and certainly the reduction of use of vehicles. I thought that was, I didn't know 71% of New York City didn't use vehicles or didn't use its vehicle or didn't have a vehicle. But I thought that was interesting, and I'm inclined to maybe determine if there's even more validity than I'm aware of to that argument. I thought one thing I want to express my appreciation for with Roger was that he pointed out what I believe is the cause of the current condition in urban centers, and that was the past practices of redlining and similar government-influenced programming or policies that would put persons or poor persons of color in a select section or zip codes, preventing them the opportunity to find some sustainability or acquire sustainability, to purchase homes, so on and so forth. I believe that is a major cause of our current condition today, not just in Syracuse, but in other urban centers around the country. I think it also lends to an idea of maybe where part of the focus, not all of the focus, should be. And I think it's kind of been there in some respects, and I don't point this to any particular person or group. I think some of them has kind of been there out of obligation, as opposed to being motivated by human interests. I think there needs to be more of a focus on citizenry as opposed to African-American citizen, Asian citizen, white citizen. While we understand, let me be clear, I'm never a person who said I don't see color, I see fine, but a person is a person, and every person has a right to self-sufficiency in order to provide for themselves and their family. One thing I thought was interesting, though, I'm not a fan of, I'll call contracting cities. I think it's more practical that cities expand from the center out. And understandably, I think the fact that you have activity around the edge of cities demonstrates as much, because those activities or those developments are not coming center city, they're going in the other direction. And so I think that's a natural process. I don't want to sound too much like a nerd, but even demonstrated mathematically that things tend to unfold from the center out. What I did think was interesting, though, of what you referred to, Roger, as a binary approach, which to me said almost a hybrid approach to development, urbanization. I'm always a person who says I'm not a no person unless you're a no person. I'm a win-win-win kind of person. And so, but I don't think it impractical that you can have simultaneous effort from center city and from the edge of the city. I'm not claiming to know how that would work, but it sounds interesting to me. Last thing I'll say in that respect, which I probably should have said first, appreciate you having me. and I'm looking forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you both. So if we go back to the title of even the symposium, the idea of stretchy cities, we hear words like continuous cities, elastic cities. We're describing political, spatial kind of phenomenon in the way that we use these words. And we've embraced a lot of binaries or dichotomies in thinking about urban development or development, town and country, city and suburb. But now we're at a time where we're starting to blur certain aspects of what we imagine those things to be. I think I'd start with Roger as far as understanding what is the future of how we should begin to understand the metropolitan area. How do we need to define it? I mean, clearly you're talking about suburbanization is the condition, and it takes on different forms in the way that we see it internationally, which I think is brilliant to read your books and to understand the biases that we have through Anglo-American viewpoints of homeownership and suburbs. And so I wonder if you could start to talk about how you define metropolitan areas. What is that for us in the future?
One of those papers that I updated is to show my credibility that I've done is I did with a former PhD student who's now a professor at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, J.P. Addy, and he and we sort of almost a little bit too clever came up with this idea of we also have, you don't just have Jane Jacobs in the city, we also have Richard Florida to deal with. So he talks about the 3 T's, so we sort of cleverly adapted that, and we talked about these 3 T's, and they were territory, technology, and talk. So territory is one thing, and it is really difficult to think about the metropolitan region now in territorial terms, but in the 1950s, when the municipality of Metropolitan Toronto was created, there was a point to be made there to say, let's define the territory and then plan for that territory, which is why Toronto now has this planned sprawl. It's not as sprawling as it's not like Houston, but it's planned, it is zoned, and now 50 years later, as we pointed out, Toronto is a fairly good city to be in, particularly because it was territorially defined. The second thing is technology, which is really important because we say, and I said I lived in LA. Most people think that LA it looks the way it does because of the car. That's part of the story, but really LA was built on rail. Huntington and these big rail entrepreneurs, they built rail lines into the desert and then sold lots along these rail lines. So the sprawling character of LA was to some degree influenced by that particular technology of the last turn of the century. But then the cars filled it up more, right? So the preponderance of the technological means that we have at our disposal is really important to understand, has an impact. I'm not a determinist, a technological determinist, but it's important. But it's also important to understand that Amsterdam, a generation ago, was an automobile city. It's not anymore. So we can do something about that. We can apply technologies really smartly. And I don't like to use that word because it's now become a catch-all phrase for all things, And you may also have heard that Google is building a model city and wants to build a model city on Toronto's waterfront, a smart city. So we are dealing with this technology question all the time. And I think we have options. We can change things, and we can use that technological debate to create different kinds of societies. And lastly, it's talk. It is about how we talk about the region. So if people constantly point fingers at each other, inner city versus suburbs and so on, with us, I think everybody in this room knows Drake, right? And Drake likes to talk about the 6. The 6 is the last digit of the area code 416 for Toronto. So when he says he's in the 6, it means he's in Toronto. But there's also the 905, which is that sprawling emerging region around. So if the 6ers are talking to the 905ers in those terms, the talk about the region can really cannot emerge. On one of the maps I showed you, the Greenbelt. The Greenbelt is a nice example where these things come together. The Greenbelt is a territorial strategy. The Greenbelt is a technology. It's a technology of very much what Ed was talking about, sort of green strategies to build something. We don't have, solar farms, but the Greenbelt is a place where, you can apply. The Greenbelt is not a natural place in the sense, but it's a place where technologies are being employed. But it's also important now that people in Toronto are starting to talk about the Greenbelt like New Yorkers talk about Central Park. You can't touch it, right? So it has become part of the conversation and part of what people believe. So those 3 T's, talk, territory, and technology, help us understand how we can define a metropolitan region. And that works differently in New Delhi from Paris, from Toronto, from Syracuse, right? So there is no one definition where these 3 things fit together.
Right. So based off that, I wonder, David, if we could get some thoughts on the idea of thinking about what has been built and whether it's been planned and designed or if it accidentally has happened, if it's one of Owen's laws, right? Or, how then, what are lessons learned or ways that we should think about the role of density? I think that you all have very different perspectives on density and what that means in contributing to sustainable development. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that.
I think when I think about density, it was initially in response to people who are talking about public transit and the idea that you can just create public transit and then you have it, but you can't. It has to be built in an environment that makes it possible. Even in a place like Portland, which is a very public transit friendly place, you often see these rail cars driving around with nobody on them. It's not sufficient to have, or a place like Phoenix, metropolitan Phoenix, where there's a kind of a minimal public transit system, but you'd be crazy to use it because you can't go anywhere, or, unless you don't have a car and you're going to a place where it happens to go, it's impossible. It's more an argument that if we want to do these things, they require certain conditions. I think one of the difficulties of translating ideas into practice is that I don't know how it is in Toronto, but there are a lot of, or how it is in Syracuse, there's a lot of different government bodies that have to go together. Even within a municipality, the different departments don't necessarily communicate with each other. And when I saw this when I was working on my book about water and the Colorado River, you could have the water department making decisions and the municipality making decisions with absolutely no connection between them. The municipality would make a decision to permit the creation of a subdivision without discussing with the water department how they were going to get the water. And it was simply the water department's responsibility to provide water for that suburb. And then that water department didn't even have the ability to put a price on that water. That was determined, basically politically determined elsewhere. And I think you see that in my state where the local zoning and planning commissions have certain ideas that the state then has different ideas, and there's no there's no intersection between all of them, and there's definitely no regional kind of planning. I think also economics tends to kind of overtake things and demographics, so that people my age, I'm 64, the baby boom generation are suddenly thinking, geez, this big house and this big yard, this is it was really more fun when we were young and we lived in the city, or we lived on a college campus and you could walk across the campus and go to a movie or go to a concert. We should live in the city. And so you see in some urban cores, it's like the white flight in the other direction. And my daughter and her husband lived in Harlem for the first few years that they were married. And my daughter described the stages of the gentrification of Harlem, which was, she said, the first step is that Starbucks comes, and the next step is a coffee place for people who despise Starbucks comes. It's and that was the stage it was at when they moved away. And in the great mortgage crisis in the United States, the people who were hit were very typically at the outer edges of suburbia. It was this whole idea, drive till you qualify. those were where the sort of the sketchiest mortgages were in the outermost suburbs, and those were the people who were hardest hit. So I don't know that it's big enough to be a huge trend, but I'm trying to sell my house right now, and I told a friend of mine, I said, it's going to get the asking price is going to get so low that I'll be tempted to buy it myself, because that kind of living that was very attractive not that long ago is maybe less, although it's different in different parts of the country. I didn't really I can't even remember what your question was. I don't think I answered it, but I talked for long enough that I don't have to go back.
Totally fine. I have a couple of questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience because I know it's already getting time. I think for Ed and Khalid, that there's the sense of, I've heard a little bit about the studies for consolidation that have happened for Onondaga County and Syracuse. And we know that consolidation, and for those of you who maybe don't know about it, there's been a study that looked at modernizing local government, a way that you might merge county and city together so that there are more efficiencies, so-calledly, in the way that we think about government costs, services, and so forth. And I know that you all are probably very well equipped to talk about that, whether you like it or disagree with it. I think that for me then, there's this notion that that size matters, that size is something when we think about territory, when we think about power, politics, policy, and placemaking, that all of that is coming together. There's these critical intersections. And so I would say that for Ed, for you, my question would be, when we think about consolidation or ways that we interact from a city to a county, especially with the environmental systems at play. We know that there are no boundaries into the way that we understand these larger environmental systems. They go past jurisdictional kind of boundaries, and so we can't just draw a line where a river is and say, that's where it stops. There's dynamic ways in which we understand how those things actually function and impact people, flora and fauna. So what would your thoughts be on this notion of the scale at which we need to be working at and coordinating together to talk about the environment?
Again, I don't think there's one answer that fits. I always use the statement that the devil is in the details. Certainly on certain services, watershed scales, right, certainly are pertinent. With regard to local governance and the structure of the system that governs us, I've always said that we should start with putting our minds all in the same room and say, the slate is totally clean. What would we establish as a form of local government? And try to build that. And then the next question is, how do we transition to that? I think the conversations have settled around, well, does the city melt into the county? Do we take the city structure over? I mean, those are where we get lost. And so, is the town of DeWitt going to dissolve? Or does it, the consensus report said that each individual municipality could decide. Again, I think if it's going to succeed, we go back and we build what we want to see as our form of government. One of the fears I believe the city residents have is that they're going to get absorbed into the county system, and then the county's going to run their lives from that point on, and that the suburbs will take control. And I think, based just on numbers, the population exists in the city. So if we design it properly and the representatives are in that next form of government, and there is some population-based weighting system to the representatives, then the city will be fairly represented in that larger form of government. But again, the current structure of county government is not anything, if I were living in the city, I'd accept. And the same with the town of DeWitt would have these same kinds of questions. We are fairly progressive, right? We have climate action plan. We have zoning regulations that most of the municipalities and certainly the suburbs don't have. if we melted into the county, would we lose all those controls that we currently have, that we see as progressive and where we want to go? So these conversations are difficult. And the second part of it is equally challenging, and that is we have a current structure. How do we transition to the entity that we would build where we want to go? And then on top of that, believe it or not, there is a framework that the state provides that makes these barriers even more difficult. There's a lot of difficulty in overcoming, so the state framework in which we operate would have to be overhauled as well.
Kali, if you want to respond.
Yeah, appreciate it. I was not a fan of the consensus effort. I'm a fan of big city. I just didn't like that plan. It was always my position. I think you can look at this from two perspectives. One, relative to my earlier position that I think cities evolve from the center outward. To me, and I made this pitch when I met with some of the consensus co-chairs, don't know if it's practical or not, that if an idea of consolidation of city towns actually happened, from my perspective, a more, I think, a responsible way to approach it would have been to deal with center city and the most immediate towns surrounding it first. And then at some not too distant point in the future, deal with the remaining towns. One of the things that was problematic for me is that I think rightfully so, a lot of the discussion was on financial efficiencies, saving money. What was left out of the discussion was people. So there was no discussion of the fact that the voter base in the city would be severely weakened. There was no discussion about the fact that the very effort that was consensus was a violation of the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, which two primary components, or the two primary components is, or at least at that time was, and please correct me if I miss something, gentlemen, the prevention of the dilution at that time of African American voting blocks through government consolidation and at-large elections, which is exactly what consensus was pushing for. And so I thought that that approach was, without a doubt, the wrong approach. One, I think, alternatives that it's happening now, if you're talking about consolidation, if we're really, and to Ed's point, it's really a matter of the will of the people in the city and in the towns. But it seems that another approach could be the consolidation of major services. Police services, which I think should be from the center out, obviously. Fire services, which should be from the center out. Our DPW, public works services from the center out. And water and sewage services from the center out. I think that's more appropriate. No offense to our current county executive, but they can't run the city. We can run the county, though. So I think that, from my perspective, that is, I think, a more practical approach. But responsibility, to Ed's point about the details, has to be taken when you're considering people, and their voice and their participation, their ability to participate. The last thing I'll say in this respect is relative to the idea I mentioned of maybe the most immediate towns and the city being considered first, if that becomes the people's will, is that you get a more equitable distribution of representation politically. And that was at no point a part of the discussion until the second consensus report, in which they referred to a city as a potential debt district, which was strange because I warned them not to call it a debt district in the meeting before. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. So I think we'll open it up to the audience for a couple of questions. If there are any. Yes. Oh, we have a microphone. If you can state your name and where you're coming from and then ask your question, that'd be great.
I'm Baxter Hankin. I'm an architecture student here. And my question is geared towards the conversation about consolidation. And I'm curious, in terms of consolidation, what would be the opinion about an idea that consolidation might give the city certain financial issues down the road due to absorbing areas that have more infrastructure per person, so that might become a financial liability.
Any volunteers?
I think this, again, points to the point about details and responsibility. Having a clear understanding of what it means in both directions. A lot of the discussion when consensus was ramping up was about the townspeople's, I think it's in some ways rightfully so, concern about absorbing the debt of the city. There was very little discussion about the fact that, you know, the city makes quite the contribution to the towns, and that the city would, in fact, absorb a lot of additional costs as a result of consolidation. That was not a part of the discussion. But again, it speaks to the point of, one, making sure that the information is out there, that people can be empowered enough with understanding and make right decisions, so that we understand what it means fiscally for both towns and or city. But I think it's still a matter of determining if it's even necessary. And I'm not sold. I think real consideration, as I mentioned, given to consolidation of certain services could prove valuable. And, there's a lot of concern. I'll quote the mayor of Tully when she said, I moved to the rural area because I wanted a rural life. I don't want an urban life. And I think you have to respect that. And so if there's in any way some kind of agreement that could be made, between towns and city on what it would actually look like, is it just services, maybe with some overlap, but a certain amount of autonomy maintained. And I don't profess to know how you do that, I'm gonna be honest, but I think it takes a very detailed discussion by all involved.
Can I add something to
Yes,
to
please.
This is, I don't know the local conversation here, the debate that you have here, but Toronto was amalgamated in 1998, and at the time we did a study comparing the amalgamation of Toronto and the secession movements in LA. And in the secession movements in LA, people in the San Fernando Valley, which is the top of LA, which again is one of those places where nobody ever goes to when they go to LA. This is the yellow vest territory of LA. And in the harbor of San Pedro, in 3 or 4 other places, but mostly in the valley and in San Pedro, there were secessionist movements. And they argued with the same arguments as the amalgamationists in Toronto. And it was mostly about who pays for what, and we don't want to pay taxes for something. So in LA, it was clearly racist because these mostly white suburban neighborhoods didn't want to pay for what they considered the inner city. And they were clear about it. And they were, Reagan-era conservatives, and that was their ideology. And in Toronto, it was a neoliberal tin pot revolution by the Conservative Party that was in power in the province, who was vengeful against the inner city, which was progressive people, all the kinds of people that David was describing to us, who live in small apartments and ride their bicycle and all that. And the conservatives didn't like those people, so they strafed them with political reform. So it is important, again, to think both at the same time about the kinds of things that Khalid was talking about in terms of formal democracy and who has a vote and how is the black vote diluted, for example. That was a difficult question in LA also. But this is a formal question of formal democracy. But it's also important to talk about, again, the substantive issues related to that. And so the conservatives in Toronto, just as an example, they wanted amalgamation of Toronto, which used to be in the 20th century, this was progressives were associated with the idea of amalgamation. But now the conservatives hijacked this idea because they wanted a different taxing system in which they downloaded responsibilities on the city at the same time taking money away, taking the tax power away from the city. So formal democracy had nothing to do with this. This was a grab of power and income, again, of the more wealthy parts of the city over the poorer parts of the city. So we need to see these things in, I think these are, again, there are some universals, but we need to look at the specific case in order to understand what's going on.
I have a tiny thing.
Yes, please.
Which had a small example, that there's also an emotional element to these things too, which you can't necessarily address logically. In my area, there are a number of regionalized school districts where towns are too small to support their own school, so they're regionalized. But in my town, at the middle school and high school level, there are 3 towns that form a regional school district. But at the elementary school level, all 3 towns have separate schools. It's not, they're demographically identical, so it's what the reason they are still that way, even though there'll be like 4 third graders and they're all girls in one of the schools, is an emotional feeling among parents that they don't want their child going to a different town to go to school, their little child. And it's like an anti-vaxxer argument. You can't address it with logic, or with economics, with saying these are the efficiencies. This is why I'm not sure it's addressable at all, but it's as much of an impediment to doing what on paper looks like a logical thing as any of the logical arguments would be.
Great. So we'll take one more question, if there is. Well, gentleman in the front. Yes. Yes.
Hello, I'm, is that on? Okay. Hi, I'm Tony Malavenda, and I have a question for the two of you, I guess. And when you think of all these considerations that you're talking about, all these considerations of how we think about stretchy cities and how we need to sort of take considerations of, into consideration all these other factors that have been ignored in the past, right, as we've developed. And your main, not your main thesis, but your little tongue-in-cheek comment about like anything that was planned is all, was it sort of your Murphy's Law version of development. And then you lay over it all these photos of like Mississauga, right? And what we've all seen in cities across America, in North America and in Europe, all this, and then when I think of what much of the development in the suburbs here has happened, what do we do with all that? It's already there. It's in place. And it almost feels like an invasive species, like it's reached its balance and now it's going to come back. And should we just like throw up our hands, walk away, and just let things happen as organically? Let the marketplace do this? Maybe we eliminate zoning rules altogether? How do we deal with it? I mean, it's just a tough...
I have something to say about this. But
Okay. I'm just going to hand the microphone to him, but no, I don't know. It's just a big question, and it's all these. There, like many issues that are easier to deal with in the abstract than they are in the concrete, and you don't have a blank slate that you can create a new thing. And even when you accidentally end up with something like a blank slate, Detroit, for example, where there's this incredible devastation, and you think, well, let's start from scratch with what's left of Detroit or of New Orleans after it half washes away. Right. It's still very hard to do it, and no guarantee that what people think of doing with it will end up in the long run seeming like a good idea. Is that enough of a lead-in for you?
Yeah. I have to admit, I have read David's work and I've reacted to it in my own writing, and I really appreciate it. I teach his stuff, so I know the argument, but I'm not entirely comfortable with the argument about density, and that has two reasons. First of all, the question about how do we deal with this mess that we have created. I think that these Australian researchers that I was introducing, I think they have a few ideas about, living with the suburbs we have to live with them because we can bomb them, But let's not forget that the American suburb, one of the reasons why it was created was because it was connected to the Highway Act of 1956. One of the reasons, it was a strategic thing because the Russians were a threat, and the idea that the cities would be bombed like the German cities and the English cities in the Second World War, that was anathema to the American military establishment. So Eisenhower was your president at the time, had this idea to sprawl out the cities, to spread them out so that if the Russians come and bomb you, they can only always destroy this suburb and that suburb, but not everybody at the same time. So now it's difficult to get rid of them because we can't bomb them all. It's much easier if you are Barcelona, you can get rid of it, right? So, but I don't actually mean that. Okay, so and I hope nobody from Barcelona heard that. But anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that we have to live with them. Mm-hmm. On the counter side, I think we haven't really thought through yet what those hyperdense environments mean to people and their sanity and their health and their well-being. Right. That's one thing. I love Hong Kong. It's a city I like to visit. I like being in London. I like visiting Manhattan. But these are not my favorite living environments, to be quite honest. I'm contemplating sometimes to live in one of those condos on Toronto's waterfront. My wife is also a colleague. She studies those condos. So we have been thinking about buying one to move in the mode of what you were talking about. The kids are out of the house. Let's buy a condo, live in the inner city, do the empty nester thing. Right. I'm not sure whether I can be happy in there, right? I'm not sure. I've lived in a house now for a long time, and I think a lot of people feel that way about those. Density is not, there's not one kind of density, and that needs to be taken into account. Also, two more things. The main criticism of the Manhattan argument is, of course, and David has heard that many times before, I'm sure, is, Daniel Aldana Cohen's point, I don't know if you know his work about that those people who live in New York, they have a much larger footprint than poor people elsewhere. So the Manhattanites don't have cars and they have all those virtues that Dave was talking about, but the Manhattanites fly everywhere. And they have high incomes, they live luxury lifestyles, right? So you need to keep that in context. The other side of density is what I was talking about earlier, is that I was 3 weeks ago, I was in West Point. That is the largest slum in West Africa. It's in Monrovia, Liberia. It's 70,000 people on a piece of land which is like a spit out in the ocean. 70,000 people piled up on top of one another. Try to talk to those people about density as a virtue. Right. It's not, right? Because they live in some form of economic misery. They have incredible potential and energy, and they have all those good things that people say that informal settlements have. But they also have a lot of problems related to density. Density doesn't solve anything for them, right? So we need to keep that in. It's not Amsterdam, it's West Point, right? So we need to keep that in context. So we have to make the change where we are. And we can't point elsewhere and say, we want to be like Barcelona, we want to be like that. When you are Mississauga, you need to deal with Mississauga. Because Mississauga is not going to go away. It's the point about what does a place look like in 50 years. But I don't know what the Chinese peripheries and the Turkish peripheries that I showed you will look like in 50 years. Right? Will they be Manhattan? Will they be the good place? Or will they be like the French banlieue? We don't know. And that has a lot to do, again, with these other questions about racialization, about, parking poor people. I have a friend and colleague in the Philippines who talks about necropolis, the necroburb, right? Because a lot of poor people from the informal settlements in Manila are being pushed out to those faraway peripheries where there's nothing. There is no urban resources whatsoever. There is nothing to sustain their life with. So these things have to be seen together. But I don't want to sound negative. I think we can make this stuff happen, but we need to get away from stereotyping certain living environments. We need to work everywhere and in all living environments because, as I mentioned, I believe in the idea that we now live in an urbanized society, so we need to deal with it.
I just want to say one thing briefly in defense of myself. You're exactly right about wealthy New Yorkers, and one of the things that have always been said about New York is it's a great place to live if you're either rich or poor, and that's true now and has always been true. Something else that I've written is that your electric bill, for example, is a worse predictor of your environmental footprint than your tax return is. And really our environmental problems are problems of affluence. And so there are, and in fact, if you chart energy consumption and affluence, you don't need two lines on the graph, you just need one, per capita GDP and per capita energy consumption. So none of these issues, environmental or urban planning, there's no panacea. There's no single thing, it's not, should we drink French wine or California wine and solve all our problems? It's the whole package. Right. It has to do where you live. If you have, if you don't have money, you cannot live at the outermost edge of civilization, because you can't get to your job, you can't get to services, you can't live. There are advantages at that level, at the lowest income levels, to being in a place where you don't need those goods just to connect with other people. But there are also the same advantages for the wealthiest too, and they don't contradict each other. They exist side by side, and they have to do with bigger societal problems than just how we design cities or whatever the other ones are. Anyway.
I need to add one thing which I failed to add. The friend and colleague who who talks about necroburbs, is actually a faculty member at this university. His name is Andre Ortega. So some of you might know him.
Good.
Failed to mention his name.
Great. Excellent. So I think there was one more question, and then I think after this question, we'll continue the discussion in the atrium outside.
Alex, I'm from South Africa. Is this on? There we go. Yep. As many of you may know, South Africa is the rainbow nation, as people refer to it. And obviously there we also see a lot of racial segregation and a lot of income inequality. Mm-hmm. But one thing I would like to hear in these presentations is the one word is culture, and how culture influences this urban sprawl, because you can see pretty much whenever you take any form of public transport where certain cultural groups get on the bus and kind of stick together in a way. You see it in smaller scales as well. If you come to an international meeting, how all the cultures kind of stick together. Mm-hmm. And I would just like to know, how would you include cultural preferences? And I think you mentioned it in the farming thing. Someone wants to go live on a farm, they don't want to live in the city. How do you include cultural preferences in the question of combating the sprawl?
Any volunteers?
I think the timing of the question is interesting. I don't know if I'm letting a bit of a cat out of the bag. I'm using this as an example. We being myself, chief of police here, a couple other elected officials had a discussion about the policing approach and the need for cultural diversity training and the fact that it's often missing. I think your point is very valid because of, let me say it this way. I think, and I think everybody would agree, there's obviously a lot of value to cultural preservation. I think it adds to the character, the dynamics of a municipality. What often doesn't exist, though, maybe to your point, is an appreciation for those various cultures and the understanding required to positively approach and or impact a given culture. I think the only way you do that is to have those inclusive dialogues. And while there's, I think, excuse me, a lot of efforts in that respect, oftentimes you may have heard people of color say this. You know, I went to the event and I was the only person in the room. And the only thing I attribute that to, and I'll use government as the example, is that it's often hard to get the word out. In the city of Syracuse, we have a population of 144,000 roughly, but none of us have actually touched 144,000 people. It's very hard to get the word out. The other thing I'll mention, and I think this is a key thing that's often missed, familiarity is often confused with racial prejudice. You know, when I get up in the morning, I'm inclined to think about the person who looks like me next door than somebody who lives somewhere else. I think we have to have a conversation there as well, that we tend to do what's easy and convenient. And it doesn't mean that I don't like you. It just means he's sitting right here, or I know this gentleman here. And it blurs, it creates a lot of problems, and it creates a lot of alienation, you know, I think, between people. So I think it's just a matter of discussion and clarity, understanding that there's nothing wrong with choosing what's familiar, right? But sometimes we have to go outside our comfort zone. But you only really find a way for inclusion by having, I think, a respectable number of people from diverse backgrounds involved in the discussion.
I'd like to add one thing, and I'm glad you asked that question from the point of view of South Africa, where I've been a couple of times, and we've done some studies there also. And I've been to the one city in South Africa which thinks of itself as being entirely cosmopolitan, called Cosmo City by Joburg, which has everybody, and they make their identity on that. But your country and this country and my country have one thing in common: they're settler colonial societies. Mm-hmm. And the chips have fallen a long time ago where those cultures are and who owns what part of the city. In your country, most explicitly through apartheid. But apartheid was built on a Canadian idea of the reserves for our indigenous people, right? And here in this country, the plantation was a metaphor of how to organize the land. So how groups group in space, and I'm not talking about the interpersonal relationships here, but I'm talking about what you observed, where people get on the bus, has a long history. Redlining, those kinds of things are inscribed in the landscape, in the rural landscape, in the urban landscape. So we cannot look at that innocently. We have to, again, using those Eastern European scholars as an example, we have to confront that. We need to constantly challenge what we see and not normalize those groupings. We cannot afford that anymore, right? It's really important, particularly for our three societies, and there are some others like Brazil and so on, Australia, which have exactly that. The Europeans have different kinds of issues, right? They have terrible issues of creating fortresses and so on, to not accept the African migrants and all that. That's a different kind of problem. But we settler societies, we have to look in the mirror and we have to do something about those kinds of inherited traditions that structure the way our cities are built and our suburbs are built, right? So we need to think about that. And all three societies are very different, right? We have different forms of racialization in Canada than you have in South Africa, and you folks have here in the United States. There are similarities, but they're different.
Great. Well, thank you, panelists, for joining us for today. Thank you, everyone, for coming. So I will just say that we will continue the discussion. We'll just be, there's a reception outside in the atrium, so hopefully you can come and talk to our panelists. Thank you.